Trip 21, a Mark Dahle Portfolio. How's he doing? He hasn't woken up yet. He will soon. And stop worrying. He'll never notice. Will it work? Hyptrolysis always works. He'll think it was his own idea. If he doesn't make it back, he'll think it was his own fault. There was a pause. You knew when you voted for this that it was a gamble. Yes, it's just that I was surprised when I saw how easy it was. How do we know that we aren't under hyptrolysis ourselves? A laugh. Unfortunately, when you invited J-Rex onto the team, you lost the ability to know that one. The future wasn't what John imagined. He knew he was jaded. He was always in a fog for the better part of the 2-day cycle. He could barely regain consciousness before he was yanked back. He also knew he shouldn't complain. Nobody else was getting this much exposure, not even Say, who had more seniority. John had been lucky enough to be the first human trial, and then, since they wanted to find out about residual effects, long-term exposure risks, and a host of other things that required multiple trips, they kept sending him. As long as he could sign the waivers, John probably would get to travel more. But now that the fog was finally clearing from his brain, he guessed that he had only 30 minutes left, 45 tops, to look around. He took a cautious step, found he could move, and began exploring. John's job was to time travel and to pick up something, anything, from the future that might prove useful. A product that could be reverse engineered, or a stock tip, the name of a politician who would rise in power. Anything that they could use to generate income from the experiment. At this point, he had made so many trips it was getting harder to find things the corporation didn't already know and control. They'd been buying the future based on the information that he brought back. He hadn't noticed any changes on his second or third trip, but on the fourth trip he had. By his 10th trip, the corporation's stake in it had grown so large he could no longer easily find something they didn't know. Part of the problem with finding new information was the coordinates. He was sent to the same location each trip, an abandoned lot in the middle of an urban cityscape. On his first few trips, he thought it was just bad luck that he was going somewhere so empty. Then he had checked the city records in his own time and found the corporation had bought the 4 square blocks he was traveling to before the experiment began. He supposed they kept the site abandoned specifically so he could time travel there without being noticed. But it meant that what he found was limited to litter the wind blew in, or to what transients and stray animals had dropped. The site wasn't always completely empty. Burning garbage stung his eyes so bad on one trip that it took a whole month to recover. He was always immobilized by the mental fog when he arrived, and by the time he could move to try to protect his eyes on that trip, it was too late. He'd been in ICU for 3 weeks. The next trip was better because the corporation decided to skip 20 years in its systematic mapping. The month he couldn't work had been more costly to them than having an incomplete map. They sent him back before he was really ready, before his eyes had fully recovered, but on his next trip the location was not on fire. It was back to its abandoned state. Grass had grown to full height and gone to seed. An alligator carcass scared him before his eyes focused and he saw it was long dead. He would have failed entirely on that trip but for a scrap of paper that had blown into the grass with the name of the mayor on it. He was now on trip 21, unless he'd lost count, which was possible, since he'd been told that his memory was starting to slip. The corporation had run extensive tests at the end of every trip up to trip 15. Memory, physical stamina, blood count, intelligence. Some of the tests were painful, some were just boring. On trip 12, he had started to record some of the data out of curiosity. Each trip thereafter, the numbers, almost all the numbers, changed, and not for the better. When he was being tested after trip 15, he asked about it, citing some of the prior numbers. That was when the corporation first told him about his slipping memory. He was never tested again. John was thinking about these prior trips while walking swiftly through the 4 blocks inside the perimeter, scanning the landscape for a piece of paper blown by the wind or some other artifact. Sometime soon he would have his last trip. He didn't know when it would be, but his bones were starting to ache all the time, not just during the fog. For all he knew, this might be his last trip. Something was up, that was for sure. John had noticed it in the team's eyes. A flicker at the corner of Lat's eyelid, a glance down at the floor from Say, the complete absence of J-Rex, who usually obsessed over every detail before a trip. John knew something was up. He just didn't know what. He shook himself. Time was of the essence. If he was going to find something useful, he needed to find it fast, and a thought came to him. He had never walked past the perimeter, ever. He had been told exactly how far he could walk, and he'd always stayed within the boundary, usually way within the boundary. He didn't want to get stuck in the future with no way back. But if this was going to be one of his last trips, or even the last one, he decided to explore. He picked up his pace, calculating the time. He estimated he had 26 minutes left. To be safe, he'd save 24. He could go 12 minutes maximum outside the perimeter before he had to turn around. Turning around at 10 or 11 minutes would be safer, but he wanted to see as much as he could. John wasn't allowed to take a watch or any other jewelry on the trips. One of the reasons he was hired as time traveler was that his body held no metal, no fillings in his teeth, no joint implants, no food chip in his brainstem. He had tried to take a plasticom watch on the trips, but the team rejected the idea. They said it might cause him to stand out, depending on the fashion of the future. He had argued that not wearing a watch might cause him to stand out, but that argument hadn't prevailed. So now he was counting 1001, 1002, 1003, hoping he was accurately tracking the seconds until he had to turn around. He didn't really know how much time he had. He was just guessing. Sometimes the fog lasted longer than others. He started running at a loping pace that he could maintain, counting the seconds, trying to notice everything he could as he crossed the established boundary into a part of the city that the corporation hadn't owned when the experiment began. For the first few minutes of his exploration, the impression was so slight, he didn't even notice. It grew as he loped farther past the boundary. Something in his subconscious was trying to get his attention. But for a while he was focused on what he could see. The whole city seemed deserted. At least the part he was in. There were plenty of artifacts he hadn't seen before, but no people. About the 7-minute mark, the impression from his subconscious was so strong John knew that he should pay attention. He also knew he couldn't listen to it if he kept running and focusing on counting the seconds. John stopped counting, hoping it didn't cost him the return trip. Whatever it was, if it was important, he didn't want to miss it. And he could feel its significance. He glanced around the area. What had his subconscious noticed? Then he saw it. It just sort of stood out to him as he scanned the scene. An alligator. Another dead one, like the one that had startled him on the earlier trip. He moved closer to inspect it, knowing it was costing him seconds if this wasn't what his subconscious was pointing him to. But it didn't take long to spot. There was movement inside the alligator's eyes. It was like John was being watched by the dead predator. It was. John blinked with surprise. He had seen it in an instant with a flash of insight. The alligator wasn't just dead, it was being eaten from the inside out. Something was inside the shell of the beast, and John had caught a glimpse of it near the eye. But why would that cause such a reaction in his subconscious? Why would he care about that? He'll never notice. Paul's voice. John heard him in his imagination as if remembering something Paul had said to him. He'll never notice? Who will never notice? Notice what? John figured he had 4 minutes left before he had to turn back, but a growing alarm inside him caused him to turn back early. Something wasn't right. John started running full tilt towards the perimeter. He was no longer loping, but he was also unable to make sense of what he'd seen and heard. As he neared the perimeter, he spotted another alligator, dead, on the left. Again, he was captivated by the sight. Why was the image so compelling to him? He'll think it was his own idea. If he doesn't make it back, he'll think it was his own fault. Paul's voice, again, as if John had heard him and then forgotten about it. But Paul had never said that in John's presence. Slipping memory or no, that John would have remembered. John was inside the perimeter, racing towards the precise spots of the coordinates, and was almost there when if he doesn't make it back, he'll think it was his own fault. The realization clicked. Paul was talking about John. John was the one who would think it was his own fault if he didn't make it back. Back to what? The coordinates? And if so, what would he think was his own idea? Going beyond the perimeter? Another alligator, this time on the right, very near the coordinates. This one was also being eaten alive, from the inside, by some unknown. John stopped. He had seconds to decide. If he was going back to his own time, he had to get into place now. But if Paul had planted a thought inside him, to go outside the perimeter, how many other thoughts had he planted? It took just an instant for John to know what he wanted to do. It wasn't going to be his fault if he didn't get back, missing the time shift. It was going to be his choice. As John stared at the alligator, he realized the image was compelling to John's subconscious because John was like the alligator. And if John was being eaten alive from the inside by someone else's thoughts, John was going to stop it from getting worse. Staying in the future might not make things any better, but going back to J-Rex and the team was clearly the wrong direction. The time was tight, but John risked it. He grabbed the dead alligator closest to the coordinates and dragged it by the tail to the exact spot where he had stood for all his return trips. He positioned the alligator inside the marks. Then he ran. He didn't know how wide the sweep actually was, so he ran as fast as he could until he was far outside the perimeter. He turned around just in time to see the alligator disappear. He smiled. J-Rex and his team were going to have a more interesting day than normal. John turned his back on the sight and started moving cautiously toward the city before him. He was probably going to have a more interesting day than normal, too. Mark Dahle Portfolios can be read in a few minutes and enjoyed for a lifetime. Unlike many picture books, the text is unrelated to the photographs and the paintings. This might seem a little weird at first. One thing that helps is to order more portfolios or watch more YouTube videos of them until you get used to it.